So thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Natalie Gattegno. I'm a faculty member at the CCA School of Architecture here. I'm also the coordinator of Ecolab and also co-principal of Future Cities Lab. For most of you in the audience, students, you're probably familiar with me, and probably familiar with Ecolab. But for those new to the school, Ecolab is a research and design laboratory that focuses on the increasingly complex relationships between organisms, buildings, and their environments. eLab is composed of CCA faculty, students, and professionals interested in exploring the synthetic, complex, and network nature of our contemporary surroundings. Through design studios, workshops, lectures, symposia, and curricular development, eLab is focused on investigating issues of sustainability and ecology through critical, analytical, and an experimental framework. So this colloquium, Territory, Architecture Beyond Environment, is an Ecolab provocation. It's a call to question and a rethinking of contemporary notions of nature, ecology, architecture, design, and technology in light of the expanded notion of territory in architecture. This is a tall order, but one we see necessary especially in the context of architecture and especially in the context of a design school. In light of David Gisson's edited volume of AD, Territory, Architecture Beyond Environment, we invited certain key contributors to the issue, designers, thinkers, authors, and given them the title of provocateur for the evening. We have given each participant one question, a tough question, and asked them to respond, either through their own works that they may have presented through the issue of AD, Territory, or through the work of others, other contributors, or other people in the field or allied fields. So we asked them to put forward open-ended answers to two questions. One question, which takes on the contemporary remaking of nature, and one that questions the future of architecture in light of this new nature. For those of you in studio upstairs, you probably received the kind of short versions of the questions on your desks. Each participant will have 5 minutes, 500 words, 5 minutes to present. These are rapid fire answers. These are rapid fire. I'm going to work on this. I have all of these flags and stuff that I'm going to search. So these are rapid fire answers, which will leave us with enough time to debate, discuss, and maybe even argue a little bit. The plan for the evening, after these kind of 5-minute responses take place, there will be a discussion and then a small reception and a book selling and signing outside. So we're envisaging being here until about 8:20, 8:30, and then heading outside. So this conversation is one that was started by David Gisson, editor and contributor of AD Territory, Architecture Beyond Environment. David is an associate professor of architecture at CCA and a historian and theorist of architecture and urbanism. His recent work focuses on developing a novel concept of nature in architectural thought and developing experimental forms of architectural historical practice. David is also most recently the author of the book Subnature, Architecture's Other Environments. So advancing new relationship between architecture and nature, this issue of AD emphasizes the simultaneous production of architectural objects and the environments surrounding them. Conceptualized within a framework that draws from physical and human geographical thought, Territory examines the possibility of an architecture that both responds to and actively produces its external ecological conditions. The architecture presented here scans and modifies landscapes, atmospheres, arboreal zones, magnetic fields, habitats, and toxicities, enabling a new and intense geographical pattern and effect within architectural and urban experience. Territory charts out a performative spatial territory for architecture that exceeds our current understanding of context and environment by suggesting that architecture might formulate strategies for new forms of environmental modulation and generation that questions its role in relation to the natural world. So please join me in welcoming David Gisson, who will be giving a short introduction and presenting our first group of speakers and their first provocation.
It's a big step. So Natalie and I agreed I'd have 10 minutes, so please don't think I'm long-winded for not speaking for 5 minutes. First, thank you so much to Natalie for hosting this, and for Isla for placing this in the school's lecture series. Also, thank you to the contributors and those contributors who are also participants in this symposium, students at CCA who brought out many of the ideas that are in this issue, and my wife and colleague, Rachel Schreiber. And of course, thank you for coming to this event. So I just wanted to use this time to explain some of the concepts behind the issue and where I see it as being positioned in contemporary debates. When a guest editing this issue fell into my lap, I decided I really wanted to use it to rethink a debate that's been simmering within a lot of contemporary architectural theory and design practice. And very simply put, that's a debate between the ideas of environmentalist architecture on the one hand, and the ideas of what is called an autonomous or autonomy in architecture on the other hand. And these two approaches are, since let's say the 1960s, have been endlessly at odds with each other, something that very much continues into the present. Now, most of you have an idea of what an environmentalist architecture is, but the ideas of an autonomous architecture might be a little bit more vague or unknown to you. So very simply put, architectural autonomy is a call for architecture that has a performative distinction from its surrounding influences, whether these be urban, environmental, or cultural. For the autonomous architecture stands against the givens of the world as an intellectually and formally distinct form of practice. So the idea has acquired a recent history of its own. And so the coinage, autonomous architecture, can be traced to an Austrian architectural historian named Emil Kaufmann, who said that autonomy is what makes architecture modern. And he identifies this first in the work of Claude Nicolas Ledoux, a French 18th century neoclassicist, who he says tried to make buildings that appeared as distinct objects relative to the surrounding nature or the cities within which those objects were found. And he traced this idea up towards Le Corbusier and argues that Le Corbusier develops an architecture that somehow rejects the industrial city and arises up from it as a distinct object and form. Now, in the 1960s, autonomists within architecture begin using the idea of autonomy to reject other types of givens within the then contemporary reality. Now, among rejections of the city and its given form, certain architects also begin rejecting ideas of environment and also the technological and consumerist environments of cities, the kinds of places that are celebrated by writers like Denise Scott Brown or Rainer Banham. Now, in particular, architects such as Aldo Rossi in Italy or Peter Eisman in the US, working in the late 1960s and early 70s, attempt to generate an architecture that's aloof from given environmental or technological relationships, or that attempts to take these types of things and sublimate them within architectural form, to suppress them. Eisenman most famously rejected the concept of environment as having nothing to do with architecture. So in many ways, contemporary autonomy environment debates simply reiterate those of the 1960s. On the one hand, we have a form of building, on one hand, we have environmentalists calling for buildings to be completely sublimated into the processes and things that constitute environment, whether that be sunlight, wind, air, vegetation. On the other, we have architects who, again, demand that architecture reach into its history and the history of its theory to develop something that stands against what is given. Now, like various people that argue for architectural autonomy, I'm sympathetic to the belief that architecture should not be completely absorbed into the metrics or mechanics of environment. I'm sure that we can agree that there's many so-called environmental, green, sustainable buildings that we see in cities today that appear to have nothing to say except that they should somehow passively reflect their surroundings. Now, on the other hand, I'm very interested in this geographical concept called the production of nature. And this idea complicates the given debate between autonomy on the one hand and environment on the other. Now, this idea suggests that the environment and the various constituent natures that form it are produced by human society, that those that nature itself now has a conditional autonomy from itself, a very difficult idea, but one that within 2.5 minutes I'll somehow explain to you in a little more detail. So there's an argument to be made that we've entered the era of the production of nature, in which both politics, industry, all of the aspects of human society generate our dominant ideas, experiences, and forms of the natural environment. For the geographer Neil Smith, who coined this idea, every tree, every breath of air, every flow of water has been reworked by the representations and machinations of industrial society. This is one of the most depressing and simultaneously exhilarating ideas. So the idea of a territory architecture, if this is true, if the above reality is true, if you take that to be true, and I think it is, then there's the opportunity for architecture to reveal and be positioned within this reality. That's the idea of a territory architecture, at least for me. Here, architecture not only uncovers this, but it generates ideas, experiences, and forms of nature that are as much about the theory of architecture as they are theories of environment. So an architecture fashioning environment has a conditional autonomy in the world. It denies the sublimation of architecture into the environment, understood as a singular thing, in favor of a process that literally deconstructs our notion of environment. So a territorial architecture is explored throughout this issue, I believe, and it's one that uses architecture to develop new classifications of nature-environment. This is an idea explored within the issue, not necessarily tonight, by Mitchell Schwarzer, among other people in the issue. It's an architecture that produces new urban forms of nature. That's something explored by Javier Arbona. It's also one that rescales nature, something illustrated by the work of Peter Anderson, Byron Kuth, Liz Ranieri, and Craig Scott, and theorized by Isla Berman, again, all within this issue of AD. Finally, something within the idea of territory is about bringing nature into the representational theories of architecture, and this is a project further examined by Natalie Gattegno, Jason Johnson, and Nicholas Demoncho. So this issue just begins to consider a way past the autonomy environment debate, something, again, that still lingers within contemporary practice, and it shows some alternative ways of looking past these issues. The issues leaves us with many ideas and suggestions that require some more details, some more fleshing out. We are left with some lingering questions. And so one of the provocations tonight that I'm hoping the next round of speakers will begin to further address is how exactly can nature be remade with the ideas, forms, and processes from the history and theory of architecture, and how can nature be remade through urban design? This is a longer version of the question up here. So responding to this, I'm transitioning into my introduction, so apologies for the speed of all this. But responding to this will be Isla Berman, director and director of the Department of Architecture and theorist and historian in her own right, Liz Ranieri of the firm Kuth Ranieri, Javier Arbona, a professor here and PhD candidate at the Department of Geography, and Nicholas Demoncho, a professor of architecture at UC Berkeley and author of the forthcoming book Spacesuit from MIT Press. So thanks again, and I look forward to this group continuing the conversation. All right.
One of the one of the definitions of nature is that it encompasses all things and processes specifically not made by or dependent on human artifice. Despite our own embodiment of nature, it's precisely our very self-extraction from the unmediated domain of real natural matter upon which the definition of nature depends. And yet we have been continuously remaking nature, transforming the geological, the fluvial, and the biotic according to the dominant ideologies through which we have mediated the real at every moment in cultural history. We've reversed and altered the flows and morphologies of major fluid arteries, converted valleys into lakes, industrialized agriculture, and constructed artificial terrain from marshland as a reinstantiation of the supremacy of 20th century technocratic utilitarian control, where nature was conceived simply as matter to be instrumentalized as a resource in the making of urban culture. What perhaps distinguishes our present from this history are two things. We've transformed the natural world to such an extent that we now fear its irreversible depletion and apocalyptic destruction, while recognizing our own biological fragility and dependence on its very existence. And two, this realization has enabled not only the repositioning of nature within our ideological hierarchy, but has also intensified our cultural obsession with it. As we suspend our own self-imposed alienation, we now want to understand nature's life-sustaining principles and potential for regeneration to ensure both its and our own survival. Nature has provided a new territory for architectural and urban thought and practice that exceeds previous models, if only because the new mixtures that are emerging between nature and culture, the biotic and the mechanistic, are specific to this moment in cultural history, its sciences, technologies, geographies, and theoretical milieus. We should not be asking how nature can be remade, but instead questioning the ideas, forms, processes, and intentions embodied in the acculturated natures and artificial ecologies that we are generating within current architecture and urbanism. A dominant model within contemporary practice, for example, is the reconception of nature now as a biotic machine for the regeneration rather than simply the production of water, energy, oxygen, and food, as well as for the recycling of cultural waste as new secondary matter. This new nature, redefined by the stratified parameters of contemporary urban density, is evident in projects such as MVRDV's pixelated urban gardens and vertically stacked forests, this new CO2 recycler of Datatown, as well as in things like the Growing Water project designed for Chicago in the 2007 City of the Future competition. In this latter project, wastewater infrastructure and space are recycled through an integrated urban matrix of eco-boulevards that link local biospheres to larger regional and global ecologies, new living machines that incorporate microbes, plants, algae, fish, and snails into cultural reprocessing systems. Real nature is systemically integrated into the urban domain and is now used to augment processes that invert the modern emphasis on capitalist production by using natural organisms to contribute to cultural digestion and regeneration. This is repeated in Field Operations Lifescape proposal for Fresh Kills, which was one of the largest landfills in existence, where 150 million tons of human waste have literally become the cultural sedimentary strata for a new landscape ecology. The Fresh Kills Reserve proposes a regenerative strategy to intensify natural wildlife by exploiting the biotic potential of its estuary geomorphology while reconnecting it to its newly colonized post-natural alien ecology with diverse programming for human inhabitation. As this nature-culture trajectory is finally inverted, the recycling of the landfill now as lifescape and the direct amplification of strategies intended to augment living systems through architectural networks, surfaces, threads, mats, and clusters redistribute flows of water, energy, and matter across the site and ensure its requisite porosity and protection. These are now indicative of a design trajectory modeled on the principles of natural regeneration, and yet whose formal, spatial, and material strategies we could say are specifically architectural. Perhaps it's only when we begin to comprehend the full evolution of our own forms of cultural production in terms of the complexity of nature's ecologies that we will initiate the inversion required for our own regenerative return. Thank you.
Keeping it going pretty quickly. Well, first of all, thanks a lot for putting this together, Isla Berman, David Gisson, Natalie Gattegno, and thank you all for being here tonight. I am just looking forward to the conversation, and I just hope to, set out a few ideas with this that can contribute to that. For the number that David edited, I wrote not only about this house, but this house had a lot to do with it. You may recognize the project and you might know the architects that did it. If you don't, that's okay. Actually, that's a little bit a part of their act. You can see one of the principals speak here at CCA, and here's a little plug for that on November 1st, I believe, in a couple of Mondays at this lecture hall. And one of the things that they do is that they change the name of the firm every couple of years, for instance, and that has something to do with the fact that they see their work as something in which they're not really the only participants. So changing the name of the firm and also calling the projects things like "I'm lost in Paris," like in this case, is a way for them to kind of say that there's a whole kind of storytelling behind the work. So what I want to talk about tonight, or just what I want to say, is that you could look at this project, right, and I could get up here and tell you a whole story to it that has to do with, let's say, what you read a lot in the media about, let's say, geoengineering, right? Like, this project could be talked about as something that gets seeded and the architect can walk away, and the thing is just it's gonna be a house that grows, right? It could be, and you hear that in architectural discourse a lot too, where the architects sort of set a series of conditions into play, and then nature just takes over, right? But I could also get up here and tell you a story that has to do with the bizarreness of the clients, and the neighbors were really bratty, and there were a whole bunch of problems with getting the house approved, and there could be, and I could tell you about the glass blowers that made these beautiful sort of bosses where the ferns grow, and I could tell you about some animals that live in there, and so on and so forth, right? And that's actually, I think, one of the things that if you go and you look at a lot of the publications and a lot of the media in which this firm kind of engages in, they tell you that story. And what's interesting to me about what's going on here today, and what's interesting about this kind of architecture beyond environment, is that you can look at the form and it's going to be completely silent or mute as to that. You can't, it's not really going to tell you whether it's either geoengineered or whether it's the outcome of this kind of large social process, right? And I think that this firm is very much interested in that second possibility of really kind of telling you the story of all the craziness that happened around the project. And I think it's incumbent upon architects now to use all the media that's at their disposal to tell these stories of how the work came about. Now, that might be not exactly what's being looked for in this question about how we kind of think about how to remake nature, right? Like, the first answer is maybe better. The first one about geoengineering fits in. But paradoxically, there's a fiction to that. There's a kind of white lie to the first case, but it's more interesting to really answer with the second question. The second story, right? And what I wanted to sort of leave you with was a quote that the architect, I'll mention him now, Francois Roche, told me on the phone when I was doing research for this article. And I think what he was trying to say, in a way, indirectly, is that not that they can think about how to remake nature. What they do is that, I'll read you the quote. Here it is. He said to me, and this is very French, right? He says, "We evaluate," I won't try to do the accent. So, "We evaluate in our work how it is interesting to be dominated by a situation." And I think that that's a great answer to the question, even though it doesn't answer the question directly, but it's really about a series of political and social conditions under which you have to kind of immerse yourself in order to rethink what is natural or what is nature. So I did it in under 5 minutes, so that's it. I'll leave you with that. For me? Oh, yours.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Nicholas DeMonto, and I'm going to test the boundaries of media here by attempting to include movies in a PDF file. So any strange things you see on the screen will be the result of that. And Natalie has agreed that any erratic behavior of the screen gives me some injury time on my 5 minutes. So, at the same time as, during the same period that Gordon Matta Clark expressed his opinion about an autonomous architectural practice by shooting out the windows of Peter Eisenman's Institute for Architecture and Urban Studies with an air rifle, he also spent about 3 years sifting through microfiche to find 15 vacant sites that form the work Fake Estates Reality Properties. Using GIS, the same search can be accomplished today in minutes and locates thousands of city-owned vacant parcels throughout the 5 boroughs of New York or any other urban landscape. The project Local Code Real Estates imagines this distributed marginal landscape as a new urban system. Using parametric techniques, a landscape proposal for each site is tailored to local conditions, optimizing thermal and hydrological performance to enhance the whole city's ecology, providing habitat, and relieving burdens on existing infrastructure. The project's quantifiable effects eradicate the need for more expensive yet invisible infrastructure. In addition, the project proposes citizen participation to conceive a social infrastructure as well, a robust network of urban greenways with tangible benefits to the health and safety of every citizen. With its focus on an otherwise invisible urban context, local code provides a jumping-off point to examine other hidden landscapes. In the context of the present discussion, an essential footnote to the project is provided by an inquiry into what nature has learned from architecture. And of course, by nature, I mean the human definition of natural systems. As the historian Raymond Williams has observed, no other nature actually exists. Mirroring the recent adoption of evolutionary language into digital design, emergence, morphogenesis, etc. Let's just hold on for a second. Hold on. There we go. Mirroring the recent adoption of evolutionary language into today's strange nexus of autonomous and environmental practice, words like emergence, morphogenesis, etc., which you can find in other issues of AD, few fields have more consistently turned to architecture than evolutionary biology itself. Much as in our own current literature, it is littered with terms unrecognizable from their original use. Architectural terms like foundations, building blocks, blueprints, and the German Bauplan, or building plan for the fundamental architecture of life. As Adrian Forty has observed, the consistent application of natural and particularly biological language to architecture has served in actuality as a persistent barrier to considering the manifold natural systems to which a building is actually connected. Most problematically, such metaphors tend to buttress the enduring fallacy of the building as an independent object and perpetuate our collective abdication of responsibility for the influence of architectural choices on the world at large. Yet, fascinatingly and somewhat reassuringly, the reverse is also true in biology. The deployment of design language in biology has served to perpetuate an idealized, overly deterministic vision of the operations of genetic systems. These metaphors, architectural metaphors, have served, ironically, to mask the qualities of natural processes that are also inseparable from the reality of crafting buildings and landscapes, things like chance, contingency, complexity, and luck. To those who begin to ascribe a godlike power of optimization in the operation of natural selection in Darwin's own lifetime, the master himself lamented, "Great is the power of steady misinterpretation." It was with deliberate irony, then, that the late evolutionary biologist Stephen Jay Gould deployed an architectural metaphor to attack the foundations of such design-centric biological beliefs. In a seminal 1979 essay, Gould reasoned that under this then ubiquitous adaptationist viewpoint, the pendentives of San Marco, and let me try and show them to you. No, it's just going to go. Well, we'll just leave it going. You know what a pendentive is, right? Gould reasoned that this, under this adaptationist viewpoint, that the pendentives of San Marco, which were termed spandrels by this disciplinary interloper, it doesn't really matter. Okay. Would be understood to be a perfect adaptation, these pendentives, to showcasing triangular paintings of angels. Instead, of course, they share with the urban islands of local code the quality of a discovered and exploited leftover. The useful exploitation of spandrels, as such moments are now termed in biology, is now held to be responsible for such trivial evolutionary achievements as feathers, the vertebrate skeleton, and human hearing. Most relevant to our own discipline, in the time since Gould's essay, some of the most innovative work in evolutionary biology has focused on the contribution of inaccuracy, inefficiency, and disarray to the very qualities of natural systems, their robustness and resilience, that we seek most to emulate in our cities. It is a view of nature that is essentially and crucially urbane. In this light, DNA becomes much more like a real architectural blueprint versus our enduring idealization of it. Such elegant texts, blueprints, or DNA, however lovely, turn out, in the larger scheme of things, to have very little to say at all in the way the world transpires. Thank you very much.
Good evening. So all of us here this evening share the commitment to moving forward with sustainable thinking. And regardless of design approach or discourse, strive to work in concert with the complexity of natural systems. How we draw ideas from nature, however, is where we may contribute differently to this galvanizing and powerful platform of sustainable design. In an effort to address these questions on how nature can be remade, Byron and I wanted to share some areas of interest that have informed our thinking and look at folding water as a case study. The land artists of the 60s and 70s, whose work rescripted our understanding of the environment through the framing and amplification of natural systems, and whose environmental interventions brought forth cultural ideas through the meaningful rearrangement of ordinary ground. Folding water centers on an idea of infrastructure that registers one experience in real time and internalizes the values of ecological and cultural sustainability. It is a dynamic levee system designed to preserve the waterfront as we know it and to conserve the estuarine ecosystems that are dependent on tidal action. Rosalind Krauss, writer, critic, and author of Passages in Modern Sculpture, talks about work that is experienced in two ways: analytic time, in which the viewer grasps the structural logic of something and remembers it, and real time, in how we experience something as an encounter and how it changes with each interaction. Similar to the earthworks projects of the last decades, we are interested in strategies that engage our environment, internalize sustainable values, and relocate our experience from an iconic memory to a phenomenological exchange. Works by Heiser, Smithson, Goldsworthy, Christo, and DeMaria are about real-time experiences, which take on issues of building in the landscape by extending nature on its own terms. We share this work because it has influenced our approach to designing at a larger urban scale. For example, Heiser's double negative, an excavation project, a subtraction of the landscape, of two massive trenches cut in alignment to each other, imply an immaterial connection. And Goldsworthy's assemblages of small fragments found within a site, arranged to heighten our perceptions of the organic world around us. The idea of folding water is that it's an infrastructural project for water, made of water. It departs from conventional static levees or dams to relocate the understanding of infrastructure from a massive dissociative intervention to phenomenological experience. Our proposal looks at San Francisco as a test case, recognizing that sea level rise due to climate change is a universal problem, yet with localized and distinct regional conditions. These estuarine recreations, or bay avatars, mirror the shoreline's present water levels, actively and ecologically, to support the varied relationship between the estuary and its inhabitants. The fold maintains water elevations for existing shorelines, susceptible to flooding, and manages rising ocean waters through the design of a bifurcated water surface strategy. The stealth infrastructure can extend natural ecology while preserving unencumbered views of the bay. Tidal cycles are artificially managed through a perforated wall of pump ventilators to transport the entire water column between shoreline and ocean waters, and recreate the sediment, salinity, and biota promoted by the tides.
aquatic infrastructure could be self-sustaining, operating its pumping system by incorporating geothermal energy plants and tidal turbines. Because it can be specifically and locally tuned to accommodate a variety of shoreline conditions, folding water can be universally applied to other estuaries to regulate flow, salinity, and volume. So, how can nature be remade or extended within its own terms? Perhaps a partial answer lies in the meaning of a dialogue that is shared between the natural world and its infrastructure, in the pragmatic performance and cultural expression. Thank you.
So moving on to question 2. Everyone's actually doing under 5 minutes. Pretty impressive. So one thing that I should set up as a kind of seed to plant in you guys as you're trying to think of like ways through which you can actually set up questions is that Ecolab in some ways is going through this kind of reevaluation of what it's actually doing and what an actual Ecolab should be working on and within the context of an architecture school. So a lot of the questions that David and I have been about vocabulary. So how do we not actually fall into the pitfalls of using certain words that mean many different things to many different people? So words like ecology, sustainability, green, nature, territory, architecture, technology, right, all fall in that category. So we're hoping that today would actually give us ways through which to develop an alternate vocabulary potentially for how we'd actually deal with these specific issues. So question 2 was actually more framed along the lines of architecture plus nature plus future. You're seeing it here. I'm going to read it. In considering architecture beyond the environment, new interdependencies develop between nature and technology that prompt architectural discourse and design to rethink operative design strategies at multiple scales. What alternative visions of ecology, technology, artificiality, and performance does this correlation generate? How do you imagine the future of architecture developing in relation to this evolution of nature? Our respondents are Isla Berman, Director of Architecture, Jason Johnson, Assistant Professor of Architecture and Principal of Future Cities Lab, Mitchell Schwartzer, Professor of Visual Studies here at CCA, Craig Scott, Associate Professor of Architecture and Principal of Iwamota Scott, and Peter Anderson, Associate Professor of Architecture and Principal of Anderson Anderson. So, Isla.
Let's just scale. As parametric practices emulate living models, responsive systems, and animate patterns of biological growth, and as green technologies are called upon to recycle cultural waste and cloak the surfaces of our future urban agropolis, smooth mixtures are emerging everywhere that render ambiguous the traditional oppositions of nature and culture or nature and technology. This newly acculturated nature is the product of very highly technological practices, but it's directly linked to the biotic by its affinities with the dynamic complexity of living systems and the continuities of matter. Even our current processes of design, often modeled on incremental evolutionary operations that emulate forms of artificial life and animate patterns of biological growth through genetic coding, while also digitally recycling existing contexts by generating new continuities from the pixelated bits of disparate cultural and environmental systems, seem to be cultural analogs to natural modes of organic recycling, as if we are fulfilling some strange ecological or evolutionary imperative, where synthetic nature emerges as an after effect of the now digitized compost pile of culture. Yet within this context, we might ask, is genetic coding and its simulation that which influences our understanding of architectural and urban morphological generation, or is it actually the opposite, the influence the influence of the cultural evolution of information technologies, now a paradigmatic 21st century model that has enabled the reconceptualization of nature according to the principles of a coded rather than, let's say, a 20th century mechanical system. Our strange fascination with these new artificial natures in their many distinct forms, seemingly symbolic compensatory acts that repeat our return to the discovery and exploitation of new virgin territories, exponentially expand the terrain of spatial, experiential, and technological architectural innovation, yet often still remain somewhat impotent when examined according to their true performance in relation to actual living systems. We are acutely aware of the fact that the architectural emulation of growing animate or atmospheric environments as an investigation of new modes of architectural form generation or the material amplification of its ambient effects do not, despite their biomimetic appeal or communicative engagement, contribute to the enhancement of real nature, larger, we could say, than our own, that is, or the mitigation of its cultural instrumentalization. Conversely, those on the other side of this nature-culture continuum, this is a trick, on the other side of this nature-culture continuum, who have been developing systemic technological explorations into energy-generating, bioremediating, and recyclable materials and systems, what I've called the so-called environmentally responsible rather than the environmentally affected, although not influenced by the geometries that emulate natural formation or its primordial sensual effects, are overtly concerned with natural material, biological and chemical processes, yet where the material functions of these processes have often had little effect on the actual form generation, spatial disposition, or symbolic intentions, that is, the design, of these biodegradable artifacts that are produced. The widening gap between those focused on creative, formal, morphological, experiential, and interactive processes and those whose emphasis is on material technologies and their ecological functioning exposes the lamentable segregation still evident in our design thinking, demanding perhaps a more synthetic, and in this case perhaps a more truly ecological, approach. Despite the pervasiveness of our symbolic return to nature, the seemingly endless appropriation and instrumentalization of the natural world for the surplus products of culture still reigns within the post-industrial and post-capitalist regimes within which we are operating. The questionable demand for the physical durability of our everyday cultural artifacts remains, for example, if the speed of design fashion dependent on uniqueness and high-velocity turnover, capitalist overproduction dependent on quantity, and technological innovation are not equally retooled according to the parameters that redirect their energies in support of the living, lest we transform the earth and all of its life forms into one sacrificial landscape. The dependence of our technologies on nature is certainly becoming evident, but the question is nature, beyond human nature that is, equally dependent on technology? Thank you.
Hi, I'm Jason Johnson, principal of Future Cities Lab, and the work that I'm going to basically show in the next 5 minutes was basically co-produced by Natalie Gattegno and myself, and also a long list of collaborators. Everything I'm going to show was started by Natalie and I, but we collaborate routinely with lots of different people. So go to our website to check out who we're playing with in our lab and our studio. I'm going to quickly read a statement that was the first sort of paragraph in our essay in David's edited volume. Then I'm going to kind of go freeform and show as many slides as I possibly can in the 4 minutes that remain. And then you can check it out outside in the published issue. The Aurora Project. As architects, we are fascinated with models that visually represent and simulate dynamic relationships in the physical world. We often use these models and the logics they reveal as analytical engines to understand the patterns around us, and in some cases as conceptual frameworks for design. These models range in their modes of scalar transformation, complexity, and intent. The most compelling of these models do not merely depict the appearance of things, but seek to reveal the irreducible nature of processes in transition. Not only are these models capable of calculating the underlying logic of these processes, they can also reveal emerging patterns in a visually discernible form. Advanced media technologies have made these dynamic visualizations readily accessible, easy to interpret, and creatively modify. This conflation of dynamic representation, simulation, and interpretation has deeply affected our understanding of the world and has fundamentally altered how we approach design. In the essay, as published in the AD article, we explore how this conflation and cross-knitting of modes of representation and simulation, including dynamic modeling and cartography, might suggest a productive new framework for design practice. So the project that we describe in the AD is really actually three projects that were brought together at the Van Allen Institute in New York City for the New York Prize Fellowship. The project was also supported by the University of Michigan, where we did a previous fellowship. So the three pieces that you're basically seeing here, I will describe essentially the guys that are on the wall. There's a series of maps that we produced called Terra Incognito. The piece at the end here is really the Aurora installation, and then this guy was called the Glaciarium project, and the three of them kind of formed the overall project. So I'll kind of talk about all three very quickly. The first thing I want to just describe briefly, things that we sort of in our office are sort of fascinated with in sort of take over conversations. The registration of remote and local information, and we're using an example here of the Aurora Borealis in the way that a remote thing like the sun, the solar wind from the sun, begins to interact with the magnetic sort of forces that are on Earth. So essentially the Aurora Borealis is a visualization of a kind of local magnetic phenomenon. The next piece that I think is really relevant to the project is the production of effects and the sharing of knowledge of those effects. This is a pretty famous painting from 1766 of a philosopher giving that lecture on the orrery, in which a lamp is put in the place of a sun. The orrery we're using as an example of something that is in a way simulating a kind of nature, a remote nature, and it's through the integration of a kind of technology and the kind of interplay of the participants, the people actually watching this. They almost become like moons themselves in this kind of composition. The thing that really prompted the project was this interactive graphic, which was in the New York Times in 2007. Many of you probably saw it. Really staggering sort of flash animation that was produced that allowed you to essentially toggle a piece on the screen. Actually, this guy right here, the slider, and you could go from 2003 to 2007, and you could see the sea ice retreat of the Arctic, which is a really staggering thing that got Natalie and I really thinking about this issue. So we were prompted by the Van Allen Institute to do a show. 1 minute, my God. Prompted by the Van Allen Institute to do a show on climate change in the Arctic, retreating ice. We produced a series of maps, which we called Terra Incognita, which looked like the thing on the left was actually how we got the funding. We then began to make a series of maps that try to describe the complex geometry of the existing Arctic ice cap and the kind of degradation that's basically going through. Then we began a series of our own maps and our own translations of that geometry. I'll just kind of roll through these. Inaugurate, network, intermesh, perforate, and sensing, and actuating. And then synthesizes all of the layers overlaid on top of each other. A complex geometric, I'm told to wrap up, series of complex geometries that were then brought together into this massive construction, which serves both as a kind of simulation and a kind of interactive model. The final version of it looks like this. It's literally thousands of interconnecting parts that have interactive sensors and LEDs intermeshed with it. And the whole idea was to basically loft the volume of the Arctic ice cap off the gallery floor and allow people to basically interact with it. This is a shot at the opening. This is a shot from below. This is the Glaciarium. I'll very quickly, 30 seconds. The larger project was about lots of people interacting with data. The smaller project, the Glaciarium, was about a single person's interaction. Basically, we were interested in taking a glacier and putting it inside the gallery. So essentially what we did was we settled upon a small ice core that the gallery basically placed inside the Glaciarium every day. We allowed the the piece of ice to melt. But essentially what would happen is somebody would approach the glaciarium, sensors would trigger a heat lamp at the top, and it would basically promote the melting of the piece. So we're playing with these ideas of entropy. That's the ice core going in. This is the degradation of the ice core over the course of the day, which would be accelerated by a person interacting with it, the final piece. And this is what it actually looked like when you looked through the glaciarium at the ice, and you could see the ice basically melting. Thank you very much.
Good evening. I'd like to ask one question and talk about two words. Question is, who today are our gods? And the two words I'd like to talk about are fear and immersion. I'm going to start off very kind of recapitulating a lot of the comments that are being made today about what's been going on over the past couple hundred years in the industrial era, in the human relationship to nature. And I think it comes under the headings of a few concepts. One is separation. The objective distance position of science with respect to its articles of investigation. I think a second concept has been domination. One of the technological control, remaking, the vast construction projects which we heard about, the industrial agriculture, architecture, urbanism that has gone on throughout the world over the past couple of centuries. And alongside that, throughout the modern era, I think there is also a third term, which is joy. The exploration, the conquest of peaks and poles, the relaxation, the peace and enjoyment which many people have taken from the natural world. Now, I bring up this period that we've been going through for a while in order to discuss the two framing periods. The period before the modern era, with all of human history, to some extent, when the birth of the gods came about, and the period that I think we're in right now, which David Gisson characterizes as this period of trying to figure out to what extent do we belong to the environment, to what extent are we different from the environment, and to what extent can we act in our own way. Before the Industrial Revolution, before the Scientific Revolution, people were immersed in nature and they feared nature. There was danger from floods, there was danger from famine. There was danger from wild animals, there was danger from disease. Danger lurked around every corner. People were immersed in nature in as much as they lived within nature, but they didn't go out of their way to engage with nature. In fact, I would say that the history of architecture from time immemorial up until the modern era has been one of carving a space for humans that was somewhat distinct from nature. So despite the immersion, despite the fact that sensation and meaning were inseparable from the natural world, humans tried to I don't think that there was no consciousness of being separate from nature, but at the same time there was no kind of embrace of it, because in fact I think there wasn't the kind of separation that would occur later. Now, all of this is to say that if you think about all of the divine systems that emerged over the course of human history, the birth of the gods has all to do with how does one deal with nature? How does one deal with the waters, the sky, the floods? How does one deal with fertility? How does one deal with famine? The gods are inseparable, I would say. They're inseparably communal institutions developed in order to establish and facilitate a human relationship with the natural world. What then can we say about our era? The era, you could call it, of the environmental movement and the environmental collapse. It begins sometime in the early 20th century, late 19th century. It certainly takes on a great deal of speed and urgency after 1970, and perhaps most of all in the last 15 years. I would say that nowadays we suffer from another type of fear. not a fear of individual random acts of nature, but rather a fear of complete and utter collapse. And I'd say we have, or we partake in, a different kind of immersion, not an immersion without domination, but rather an immersion of no or limited impact. And I guess I'd like to close by posing a question. Who are the gods of today who will constitute or judge or adjudicate our relationship with nature, if not the state, if not the corporation, if not the scientist, the engineer, or the architect? Who are those gods? Is it unexperienced, untouched wilderness, nature without humans? Is it an all-embracing humanity, the spark of genius, the flux into individuality? I think these are the kinds of questions we need to be asking ourselves. What is the kind of middle position which once was occupied by divinity, which later was occupied by science and technology, which today seems to be occupied by us not knowing how to occupy it? Thank you.
I think, Craig, you're next, if my computer comes back.
Well, that's a tough act to follow in terms of big ideas and all. But I'm going to talk about the work of our practice. And we were asked to do a 500-word text, and usually I speak to the images and go on too long, so I'm thinking the 500 words will keep me in the 5 minutes. As a practice committed to pursuing architecture as a form of applied design research, Iwamoto Scott proceeds from the belief that each project can achieve a unique design synthesis. Our design stems from a desire to heighten architecture's experiential and performance-based nature, instigating architectural innovation through pushing the work's formal, spatial, structural, and material potential to adapt and transform. We're interested in the idea of adaptation, a process whereby initial forms or conditions are adapted to particulars of environment so as to produce a transformative result. This exploration is pursued alongside continual testing of the fluid potentials of computation and material technologies. Ultimately, we aim for the physical material to act as both medium and media, purposefully non-essentialized, nor necessarily resulting in a one-to-one correspondence between a given material and its reception. 5 project types reflect different strains of our design research with respect to technology and environment. The first group are structurally driven investigations where structural logic adapts to program and situation. The second group, structural surface projects, but driven in particular by investigation into the performance of a specific material, in this case paper wood, a kind of micro-engineered version of wood that's a laminate, veneers, and other materials that can be ordered and customized in different ways. But that is interesting to us in that it's transformative in its capacity to shift perceptually from opaque to translucent, and in its lightness, physical lightness, and ability to modulate porosity and luminosity with respect to both complex geometry and structural performance. A third group, off-the-shelf building components, adapting to achieve a greater complexity as a kind of defamiliarization of the material and or system as normally found. A fourth group, also surface-based project, but in particular where light transmitting fiber optic filaments are used as a medium to shape and project daylight and or artificial light. and even information in some cases. And the last group, speculative future-based projects we've been invited to participate in, which combine aspects of all of the above at a larger scale as well, typically. But what I wanted to show quickly are two, since those projects I've presented not long ago with my partner here in the lecture series last semester and also in the summer in the biodynamic structures workshop, to show a couple of new things from the summer. Protocell line arrays is a project that was in response to an upcoming issue of AD, and the UVA CNC investigation is another project. Both of these, I think, frame a response to the colloquium questions, specifically in regards to parametric adaptation, wherein a given system's operative formal evolution employs a controlled amount of bottom-up local transformation relative to the growth of the whole. Protocell line arrays is a project done in, as I mentioned, in response to this issue, but it raises this issue of AD that's upcoming. It raises the question of how protocells, which are simple chemical models acting as living cells, might transform the language or vocabulary of architecture, and proceeds from the idea of the protocell as a primordial clay, so to speak, between matter and biology, wherein lifelike properties may emerge from simple physical systems. So here there's a given kind of pure instance and how that might grow into an impure version based on issues of site or span, for instance, largely kind of structurally driven, and how the taxonomy adjusts according to that transformation of the whole, the taxonomy of these cellular units. And then the last, the second of these two, that where UVA invited a group of architects to kind of propose or to do explorations with their new CNC router as a kind of a set of test cases of what the router might do. And so for this, we thought of the typical use of the CNC router as a way to sculpt and carve material into a kind of a pretty wide range of sculpted forms, and to not do that was really the approach. It's a project that questions the tool, and rather than simply produce a sculptural result, we aim to transform a standard, even banal 2D sheet material by playing with the material's internal stresses, such that it can assume a more nuanced form. This is achieved through the subtle tweaking of simple L-shaped modules and the manner in which they interlock with their neighbors. Thus, the system can grow into the gradient of curvature and porosity that is the resulting piece. And so these last images show the different kind of parameters that adjust its modulation. And basically, we're proposing to kerf this L-shaped piece with the router that allows it to bend into these different curvatures. So ultimately, it becomes a kind of bent wood lattice vine in a sense. And that's the last image. Thanks.
Hi. Well, I'm glad that Mitchell Schwartzer brought up the gods, because I'm going to talk a little bit about evolution and creationism and a few other things that can get us all in trouble. So starting with the main thing that interested me in the question, I would say, is the question that was put to us is the question about what are the interdependencies between technology and nature. And that's something I've been interested in for a long time. and trying to, in some ways, debunk the myth that technology and nature are different things, or that humans and nature are different things. And I'd really like to propose that we consider those together, that there's no such thing as a separation between humans and nature, so that whatever is built in the environment, whether it's built by animals, chimpanzees have been using tools a long time before humans. If you consider those kind of evolutionary discussions, the main difference is how powerful our tools are, but there are all kinds of wonderful examples in nature about how tools and really amazing uses of structure that have nothing to do with humans and human interventions. So this kind of 19th century or earlier idea that humans and nature are separate, that really actually comes more out of kind of religion, constructs of religion, than out of the reality of how the world works. So I've always been kind of interested in brushing away that separation of nature and technology, and thinking, that's technology. How can you say that's not technology? This is a wonderful anthill. Of course that's technology. That's kind of an amazing technology. This is a beaver dam. It's a beautiful, beautiful structure. Not only is it a beautiful structure, it's a structure that has huge implications of changing the environment around it. And so I think that if you look back at the history of the world, whether it was animals, or if you look at, for instance, the Venice Lagoon, we've been remaking the water systems of the Venice Lagoon since time immemorial. Really large interventions that have always been happening. So I just wanted to kind of put this within the structure. These are like small-scale radiolarian, like diatomaceous earth kinds of things. So just about anything we do that we call biomimicry, or kind of imagine that we're, as humans, now starting to tap into the structures of nature to make our own structures, they're weaker in a way. They're kind of impoverished versions of what is already out there. But at the same time, we have technologies available to us that give us much more power, and in a certain way, a lot more ethical responsibility for what we're doing. Everything we do alters nature in some way, but we do have the power and the tools to change things quickly. And so I'd like to kind of just position the work of architecture is the act of altering nature. It becomes nature. As soon as we do something, it becomes part of nature, and kind of wipe away the world, the words like built environment and artificial nature. To say everything we make becomes part of nature. I just wanted to quickly show a couple of projects. This is the one that was referred to in the book, in the AD issue. This is our Camelback Shotgun Sponge Garden project for New Orleans. The portion that got all the attention is these alluvial sponge combs, which we designed and built, and they related to dealing with nature, with the natural forces, shall we say, of extreme weather events. And rather than building concrete walls and trying to kind of make larger and larger structures that protect our cities from this horrible thing called nature, we were designing a series of things that would kind of accommodate these extreme weather events, and this is a kind of a soft levee system that was part of that. I think the important part of this project was the idea that the building, the built environment, becomes part of the environment. It's not separate, it's not artificial. As soon as the waterfront in New Orleans, there's nothing natural about that in the sense that it goes back to pre-human intervention. It's been intervened with so many times. So anything new that we do is part of that intervention. And the concept of this building, was just to kind of say that what is needed there is not a resistance to nature, but a way of designing a living environment that becomes part of nature. And so the whole building is a sponge. Funny thing is, everyone's interested in just the alluvial sponge comb. We see that as just one element out of the whole building as a sponge. I'll leave you with just one last project, kind of a current thing that we're working on, and it's now in an exhibition at the Boston Architectural Center if anyone gets to Boston currently. But we're calling it the Lips Tower, and it's kind of a study of how the mechanisms of the tongue and the lips and the throat work, but and how those could be used as part of maybe high-rise buildings or buildings in general. The part that is, see, everyone laughs when I show this project. I actually have an animation that someone said was so pornographic that I shouldn't show it again. But the intent of this is just it's not to do biomimicry, but just to kind of imagine that the world is, there's no kind of separation between technology and nature, but everything we do is part of that. So let's kind of separate ourselves from any limitations on what we design and imagine that everything we design becomes a part of the environment that we're putting together. So that's it.
Anything about this? Okay. Okay, so I'd like to ask our participants to bring their chairs up to the front and kind of ask from the audience, hopefully, a series of questions. But first, I would like to thank everyone for participating and being up for doing the 5-minute quick fire. I know that's the hardest part is the hardest part was actually making sure that everyone knew their time. So I'd like to open it up to the audience with hopefully a series of provocations, arguments. Do you agree? Do you disagree? Any other words that should be in our vocabulary? Questions also? Welcome. Lisa, thank you.
The word that was used a lot in the first and environmental that I think is so far lacking in this conversation and wants to put it out there, which is the issues of environmental justice. Who's it for? Who benefits? Who pays? Who suffers? Obviously, the sort of advanced experiments ultimately might be applied and in some way. But I would like to present that question and ask the panel to
respond. To begin, but I think it's just off the top of my head, I've been thinking a lot lately about how various arguments that have developed separately about about and around the city in particular deserve to be integrated more with each other for mutual benefit, which is something that happens a lot in nature. And I'm thinking in particular for instance, about separate discourses that take place about historic preservation, about natural preservation, about the creation of habitat for humans and the creation for non-humans and the creation of habitat for humans. If you listen to Enrique Peñalosa speak about his actions as mayor of Bogota, he uses the word habitat about 45 times, and he's not referring to birds once. You know, so I think that a series of separate conversations have arisen around the fabric of the contemporary city that deserve, in the best tradition of modern digital culture, to be mashed up and to see what comes out. That would be my first thought.
I'm going to take it in a slightly different direction because on the other side of, let's say, social justice or environmental justice, I keep sort of wondering myself, is anybody thinking about what the snails think when they become part of this new system, right? Because despite what we're doing, let's say with nature by re-injecting that, we're still appropriating it, or we're still thinking of it in the same model that we thought of it before. And yet now we're looking at a whole new set of plants and animals that become domesticated within that system. And I was thinking, interestingly enough, that I think one of the first books that I got in architecture school way back was The Architecture Without Architects, right? Anybody who remembers the 70s? You know, and the interesting thing, of course, then was it was the non-technological version, or it was closer to what Peter was showing, in the sense that it was dealing with animal habitats without any kind of human intervention. We've sort of appropriated that and transformed it, and we're still the ones speaking for, you know, all of the other, let's say, species that become a part of this world. And that was sort of my last question is, you know, is anybody asking nature what they think about what we're doing? Because in answer to your sort of provocation at the end, I kept thinking, it's true, if it's all nature, then we are an incredibly predatorial species.
Anybody want to?
Well, I guess I just wanted to add to that. I mean, when you think of justice, kind of my point about how technology is kind of inherent in all of the species, but at the same time we have the most powerful technology, we have the most powerful tools, we as humans do, and together with that comes a higher level of kind of ethical responsibility to what we do with those tools. So I think there's a really interesting kind of increasing level of responsibility on anyone who has these tools to figure out what to do with them. And part of the reason I want to erase the distinction between nature and technology is to make people feel that whatever you do is going to become a part of nature. It's going to be there, whether it's in a city or in the natural landscape. It's going to become a part of the environment, and you damn well better be taking good care with whatever you're designing, whether it's a chair or a building or a biosystem out in the landscape. It's part of the environment forever after, and so you need to be taking it very seriously that you are changing the environment.
I'm just going to add one final point. I mean, I think one of the roles that architecture can have in environmental justice is potentially use buildings to direct the form of the city and potentially the form of nature in the city. And I think there's a lot to be said that one of the key concerns of environmental justice, which is distributed risk, you know, the evenness that those of us in a city will be exposed to the hazards of a city, particularly the environmental ones, that architecture has a role in giving an image of what a more even form of urban development might be, not a city in which industry is here and white-collar work, which is largely immune from the hazards of industry, is in a separate area. So I would argue that that's a great point to bring up, and that there's an architectural form that might be able to articulate what that looks like at some massive urban level that is of yet unseen. So, yeah.
Go ahead.
I can't agree with Peter's assertion enough that humans are in fact. And I don't see it as a metaphor at all. They are working. They're self-organizing systems. And they rely upon the consumption of resources, and they create waste. And everything that we do works that way. We rely upon gathering resources, consuming them, and creating waste. And we're in competition with the rest of the natural world that we're a part of. But our very language prevents us from seeing ourselves as a part of this nature And I think it leads us to go off in these strange directions that we sometimes go into, where we feel like, well, we are separate from nature, we need to be the stewards of nature. Why do we need to be the stewards of nature? We don't. We want nature, the natural world, to thrive so that we can thrive. Because if we kill the natural world, if we destroy it, this potentially limits us in the future. Because all of these things have value to us that go beyond just the morality of it or the ethics of it. You know, there's full value actually from all the various things living in the Amazon rainforest, where we found all kinds of materials, compounds useful for medicinal purposes and so on. These are the reasons to be an environmentalist. They're strictly economical and life-sustaining, life-fulfilling, not out of some sort of weird sense of morality. Anyone care to respond to that? It's a rant.
I'll close that briefly. I think that there's two, as you might guess, I'm always a little suspicious of the kind of tendency of architects to be intellectual jackdaws and pick up anything that looks shiny outside the discipline and kind of bring it in, often disembodied from its original purpose. But I think there's two recent developments in biology that lend substance to both what you said and to Peter's assertion. One is the study in evolutionary biology just in the last 5 or 10 years of something called niche formation, which is to say that this understanding that biologists have come to have that organisms exist with a balance in their environment. The environment has the potential to convey information from generation to generation and be shaped just as the distinction between the organism and its environment is actually something that Darwin suggested should be abolished, you know, and that both were mutually shaped and evolved together, and this kind of provocatively relates to some other recent work, in this case that I'm tendentially involved in, that looks at the biological nature of cities, not as a metaphor, but rather seeks to apply biological phenomena like scaling laws and rules that govern natural systems that turn out to match, you know, with a kind of astonishing accuracy the growth, life, and mutual development of cities. So I think this notion of course, nature is a human invention, and we are. I would probably end with the words that Jackson Pollock gave to a Better Homes and Gardens interviewer when his popularity, when he was asked why he didn't paint from nature, and he leaned in close to the interviewer and said, "I am nature." So,
I have one question for you, Randy. Don't you think that's a fairly humanist view of the world? I mean, this is part of the issue here, and I want to go back to what Mitchell brought up, which was the idea that, yes, it was the fear of nature that perhaps made us create the gods, but at some point, you know, within humanist history, we became the center of the universe. And the interesting thing about, let's say, our current fear is that it somehow has potentially decentered us to make us think that maybe there's something else out there that isn't just for our own use. Perhaps. I'm just going to leave that with you.
I think it also brings up the issue just as a way of kind of linking some of the presentations where, you know, I think, Isla, you talked about synthetic natures, and in light of Mitchell's question of, you know, who are our gods now, it seems like that's who are our gods now in light of synthetic natures, right? So it's a very different terminology, right? So the gods that you use to kind of present your argument, Mitchell, are gods that are very pure in terms of what they're actually representing. So it seems within the kind of synthetic, and maybe it's a merger with technology, Peter, maybe it's a merger with representation, maybe it's a merger with design, but it's a synthetic condition. So I think in light of your question, Mitchell, I wonder if you could elaborate maybe a little bit more in terms of, or any of the participants maybe, in light of what that actually, how can we interpolate that? I mean, there's of course no answers, and it's a really tough question, but it seems like there's a lot there, so we'd like to hear more.
You know, I mean, I think what Peter was talking about, and I guess what the last question brought up, is a kind of, you know, and I think what Isla was commenting on that is the idea that we're going to make nice, rational choices, and everything about human history tells us that we don't, repeatedly, and what I see coming, is that if we were here 50, 60 years ago, when the colonies were flourishing throughout the world, the European colonies, and anti-colonial movements were underway to shake off the domination of Europe, throughout Africa, Asia, elsewhere. And there was a period when people couldn't imagine why would that not be? I mean, India did better under British rule, and so did Southeast Asia under French rule, and this was the natural order of things. And I think we've had a similar attitude toward nature to this moment. That yes, we are. I keep hearing we're part of nature, and I keep feeling queasy when I hear that, because yes, we're part of nature, but we're also destroying most of it in order to have the kind of world we want to have. And I do think there will be a kind of dehumanization movement to parallel to the kind of decolonization movement in the coming decades, because unless people, we're not going to, if we follow our traditional attitude that we're part of nature and we're existing within nature, and can't we, I would love to have that belief. I think that would be just marvelous, and it sounds wonderful. But, we act constantly in competition with one another, and we act as a predatory species. Yes, but nature doesn't have nearly the power we have. Our power is out of whack, and that's really the problem. When we say that nature has technology, it sounds great also, but if you compare our technology to natural technology, and what the kind of changes we can, the Beaver Dam, and then you look at that dam, and you looked at, Stalin in the 1930s wanted to change the climate of much of Soviet Russia to tropical. And they actually spent 10 to 20 years thinking about doing this. And we're going to implement it. We reverse rivers. We do amazingly global things of incredible power. And in the process, we're causing the largest species die-off since, since the dinosaurs. So, I'm totally sympathetic to, and I understand philosophically that we are part of nature, and that philosophically technology is shared by all species, or most species, certainly in terms of structure and construction. But I think we do have to step back and look at the reality of, especially given an election 3 weeks from today, with the Tea Party, showing we've entered a political culture where rationality and empiricism have no part whatsoever. Why should we think that our large-scale technological and constructive activities will have any more? I just think it's wishful thinking. It hasn't happened in the past. I don't think it's going to happen in the future. So I really think we have to do some heavy thinking about our role, and not assume anything, because we might not have as much time as we think.
So, started by framing this as the economy versus environmentalism, and doing such a dichotomy. Another one is art versus science, which I think is underlying a lot of discussion. So this is just an open-ended question to anyone. How is this discussion best to continue? In other words, these are very complex issues. Can we deal with them just within the framework of the scientific? So the question is, who do we need to bring in? How would this discussion be different? Nicholas, you mentioned the tendency of architects to pick up sort of shiny things in other disciplines. How would this be different if there were a physicist and a ecologist, et cetera, et cetera? Who do we need to continue this discussion?
Part of the work that we're interested in looking at, and one of the things we realized is within the design disciplines, we're using a set of tools, and we have a very distinct way of modeling and simulating understanding the world around us. And what's really, for me, at least somewhat optimistic and encouraging, is that there is beginning to be this dialogue across how we're actually making the world. So there's some, I think there's some really interesting collaborations going on right now between biologists and between architects, people that are looking at artificial intelligence, other kind of modes of understanding the world. And I think what I'm really interested in is how we're starting to make these things that are kind of cross-platform, that can at least begin to kind of take that on. So for me, the tool set and the way that we're mapping and the way we're kind of bringing together information is a really critical thing, because architects, at least the discipline of architecture right now, is so focused on form making, and that is kind of a driver. And I think we're shifting to another mode where I think modes of energy and form, say, are beginning to be synthesized, and I think that's really sort of an encouraging idea. And for me, that was a kind of subtext to some of the work that was in the publication. I'm not sure we're there yet, even 1/1000th, but I think there's some ideas that are pretty encouraging.
One of the things that I was trying to get to with the notion of both the synthetic and the ecological was the idea that when I say we're still segregated, and we're still thinking in terms of kind of modern striations, the fact that architects only talk to architects is one of the biggest problems that we have. And the fact that we become very good at what we're doing within a single sphere, so the idea of form generation happens, and I'm sort of always thinking of this with multiple hats, and thinking that, within the school our students know nothing about material, or very little about material compared to what you know about form, or about the making of form, and not about material in any kind of physical, biological way, how it transforms, etc. That's happening in a whole different world outside of what we're dealing with. At the same time, the issues of how things are being manufactured and produced, the kind of economics, the whole, social structure that surrounds it also becomes this huge issue. We're not thinking about that either. And the problem is that what we end up producing, let's say, as a reflection of our relationship to the natural world, ends up becoming sort of the lifelike, or the image of that, or the representation of nature, but becomes limited within that framework. And so one of the conditions of the synthesis is that we have to be producing new ecologies that link up multiple beings from inside and outside the discipline. For architects, interestingly enough now, the landscape architects are sort of the new heroes of ecology, because they had to deal with living material. They know a little more about what a snail might do, or how a plant might grow, than architects do. And at the same time, the biologists, sort of all of the soft sciences, start replacing in some ways some of the hard sciences that were, let's say, buttressing, engineering culture of the early part of the 20th century. So I think for us now, reaching out and starting to make those kinds of connections becomes really critical. And the other piece, and this goes back, and I totally agree with you, Mitchell. I'm afraid, of our own belief in our systems. That the other piece that we haven't dealt with at all, what I call cultural digestion, is the other side of our ecological, process. We think about what we keep producing. We don't think at all about any of its effects, its sort of long-term effects, what its ecologies might be.
The idea about cultural mythology and this sort of search for heroes. And, when you look at the puppet mechanics, when you look at these places or stages, the world is looking to design, is looking to the environment, is looking in terms of technology, is applying technology. They're not really looking at policy and economics. On the real stage, we're going to reverse it. So you could deliver this mantle of this responsibility that I don't know if we've necessarily taken on as much as it's been directed towards us. And it seems to be kind of, it emerges with the kind of magazine or well, or all kind of popular ideas about what the future and what the stage or reversal of our ecological disasters seem to be so enticing about it.
So it makes our place and position within that curious.
I mean, with all due respect, I think actually that's a myth. Because I don't think that the world is really looking to designers that much at all. I think actually, when you look at the paradigms of like green governance or like green economics and everything that Al Gore pushes about sort of carbon credits and whatnot, I think actually that's where a lot more attention is being paid than what designers, I mean, sure, certainly there are green rags on the magazine racks and whatnot, and there certainly is a lot of power that is kind of allocated towards designers, or that designers are looked upon to kind of provide solutions. But I don't know. I mean, I think that's I'm not sure where this is going, but I think that there's that to answer your statement, I think that part of the phenomenon of what's going on here right now is certainly a little bit of that myth-making of the designer. So I don't know. I mean, I want to kind of, provoke a little bit with that, and think there's, maybe something to kind of poke at there.
I would just say briefly that I do think that the, sorry, I just couldn't stop myself as it moved past. But I think Mitchell's right that geoengineering is going to be one of the great design debates of the 21st century, and it's something that we need to, I don't think we'll necessarily be invited to that table on our own. It's designed at a scale that we're not used to thinking, but at the same time as Stalin was preparing his proposals in the Soviet Union, Edward Teller was preparing proposals in Livermore for, giving the Earth a thermostat was how, and so it's a pressing and I think really interesting issue.
One more response from here, and then there's more questions, so maybe we can frame another question. So there's one in the back, right?
Yeah.
Maybe still want to ask.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. In light, I was interested in Mitchell's question as to who the new gods are, or at least what is the conceptual mediation between human and nature and in this age. And it struck me that in the pre-modern age, in the age gods that we put out there, architecture really served as a strong representational force of the gods across all cultures, and is really kind of a lot of the pre-modern great architecture is in that realm of divine architecture. And then in the modern era, architecture is really defined by the science and objectivity right up to now, with obsession with datascaping and sort of objective background to your design proposal. So I'm just kind of curious, what is the role of this architecture in representing this new mediation between human and nature, whether it's production of nature, whether it's we're all nature? I mean, it's kind of a gray area, but it seems laden with.
I think you summarized it rather well. I mean, if you look at architecture, I mean, we're probably in the period in history when architecture is least sure of who it's serving. Not the gods, not the state, not corporations, then who? Often the architect and certain clients, but the client is not exactly that committed. So it is we're in a kind of very strange area in terms of where the, what our built environment or built world is meant to, signify. I guess my biggest interest is not to fall into simple, easy answers. That's why I kind of, when I think about, these questions about are we part of nature or are we not part of nature? Well, it seems to be you can't answer that question. I mean, I can't, Eisenman just, his attitudes, I mean, it's just, I think, have been so, harmful in so many ways to architecture, this idea of autonomy and this idea of formalism, and I don't think we can separate out these things, and I think that if we try to separate them out and come and say we are, like Jackson Pollock, we are nature, I am nature, which is a great comment of the individual, but I think then we're just going to fall back into comfortable practice, and I think it's really important to keep the questions unanswered, to keep them complicated, to keep them pressing and hot, so that we're forced to deal with them, and we can't say, oh, we're what we do is part of nature, or what we do has nothing to do with nature, and either of those are fine. That we have to realize that we're in a kind of in-between situation, irresolute, and we have to that's really where we have to attend to. So it's really I want to keep the question open rather than answer it. That's really what I'm after.
One comment regarding that. I was struck recently by looking at the work of the Transcendentalists and the American Transcendentalists, and really kind of seeing in the 1830s, I mean, understanding what the role was of nature for them. And I mean, the way that I understood it was that it was really, nature was a lens in which we could view the world. We could consider existential questions about ourselves and about our connection to the landscape and the meaning of that. And I think I'm struck now to consider that maybe in fact we are at that place again where nature is a lens. And the questions are unanswered. But here we are trying to view larger issues or philosophical issues about culture, about humanity, through nature. And it goes to Mitchell's discussion earlier, but I think if there's a role for a new multidisciplinary teaming, I think the philosopher would be added to the mix.
Nature made the mason and so made the house.
Okay. One in the middle, two in the front. Oh, sorry. Okay, go ahead.
This question may be a little bit on the end of sci-fi, but do you see potentials in this human-created technology beginning to become autonomous and beginning to have an interactive relationship with this larger than human nature, beyond the control of humans? So does this produce sort of like a third hybridized nature where technology is evolving with nature beyond whatever kind of manipulations we are doing? Or does this actually create an actually greater integration where everything is nature, sort of along the threads of Peter Anderson? And does this maybe become the God, the new God, this technology that is out of our control, that is evolving and acting in its own autonomous manner?
To say about technology, but if we just think of one of the aspects of architecture as technology, I would simply let me back up. I would argue this. I'm very interested in Marx's, as you probably know, Marx's description of the endless kind of nature human dialectic, which also goes to address Randy's comment that human beings aren't nature, human beings are not nature, society isn't nature, nature isn't society, but it's an endless dialectic, and the way we engage with it transforms us as individuals and as a society. So right now we have this vision of the human world as completely dehumanized because of the subjugation of nature, right? But I disagree with some of the things that were said, particularly Mitchell's point about keeping things in this kind of this complexity where technology, nature, society are sort of endlessly mixed, and we withdraw and sort of embrace the complexity. I would actually argue that where Eisenman, in fact, is instructive, particularly at this moment, or other autonomous, is in their emphatic interest in relying on form to articulate ideas that are specifically political about human beings' relationship to their surroundings. And I think there's something about thinking of form itself and not technology, but particularly architectural form as directing the spaces within which the new form of dialectic in which human beings will interact with nature, and articulating those spaces of withdrawal, right, in terms of we will not go here, in terms of boundaries, and also spaces of new, sort of entering in new terrains, new territories, in which we go to spots that we thought were somehow beyond our reach or beyond our touch, but use architecture to begin to talk about the way that they can be conducted within society. So I actually don't think the answer is technological. I think it's architectural. I think it's formal. I think that these people that seem so anti-natural to us are in fact instructive for ideas about how to interact with nature in not even an ironic way, but in a very direct way through a sense of withdrawal, right? Very different than a kind of Wrightian belief in this organic mixture. That now I think what's called for is the retreat in some sense, and architecture articulates how that happens. Yeah.
Can I just add, what your question is really interesting, and to me, I think we're already there. We already have technologies that are beyond what we understand they will do. I mean, the unintended consequences of our technologies are everywhere. The results of that. So I don't think there's going to be any magic point at which technology takes over and starts to become like a computer that takes over the world. It already is out there. Any new technology we put out there is almost certainly going to have consequences that we haven't intended. But I just want to say I think I'm a lot more optimistic than Mitchell or Isla in both about the power of technology and about the goodness of human nature. My belief is that human nature is, we want the environment. Naturally, there's no reason for us to not want the environment to succeed and support us as biological beings. And I really do believe that technology, as powerful as it is, it can get us into bad problems, but it can also get us out of problems. So we've created problems with technology, and I think it would be a real mistake to retreat from the power of technology in trying to address those problems. So I think that the biggest fear that we should have is not technology, but the biggest fear that we should have is the lack of knowledge or the lack of education. And if there was anything that was important in the election coming up, I think it's about how do we make sure that we increase people's access to knowledge and education, because that's how we'll all make better decisions about how we use technology and how we treat the environment. So.
One last question. Sorry?
Shut down.
One last question about thank you. I'm actually not an architect at all, but I follow you guys quite often. And I'm just interested to know, because that's a big part of my life and it has been forever. And I've read, in experimental blogs here and there about it. But what role does sound play? And I've heard so much about divinity, and sound has always been used actually artificially to create divine sounds in churches or relics they've created, big, long, whatever you guys call them, kind of oscillating tapes. And so I think a return to sensitivity is more the integral middle thing you're thinking about as architects, rather than this kind of you must have knowledge or goodness or you're evil, and in that there's something very, very obvious that you're seeing is sensitivity to structure. So I was just wondering what sound plays in your world.
I can't really speak about sound precisely, but I can probably talk about sensing. It's something that our practice is sort of routinely exploring, investigating, failing at. But and there are several practices out there that are featured in territories that are looking at this, like the Living as an example, are super interested in this idea that a building actually becomes a hypersensitive device, not merely registering sort of acoustic levels or pollution, but also sensing them and then beginning to change, surface change, color change, material change based on the broader spectrum of sensing. So I think it's a really interesting for us, definitely the projects that I sort of showed really were investigating that, and something that we're really doing. So looking at how the physical environment is no longer thought of as this sort of just this sort of inanimate piece, but something that's much more sort of responsive to energy flows, certainly, but also more responsive to how a building is being used by occupants, by sort of weather, by things like animals and plants. So we're sort of looking at that.
I'm kind of going to hijack this question a little bit, but maybe not, because it struck me that this week, right, there was all the crazy sound of the jets flying over the city. It was Sweet Week, and it was this insane noise that you can only sort of only begin to imagine what life must be like somewhere in Afghanistan or Iraq, right? And the other thing is that they say that when I have no direct experience of this, but you can't really see a drone that's flying near your village, but you can hear the buzz. And I think that that's really important to think about in this conversation, because when it comes to environment, right, like we're trying to talk about these issues of environment, but first of all, military power is enormous in all of this. The whole issue of like our government, our policies, and how we're actually controlling or sort of fighting over certain resources in certain places, is sort of directly and indirectly related to this conversation we've been trying to have, right? And the thing is that what really I don't exactly know how to articulate it yet, but there's a really troubling sort of issue about how we sense and see the world and hear the world, right? And try to kind of understand what nature is and try to kind of garner knowledge from the environment, or say from what we might call nature. But we do it through all these different tools that are in many ways provided to us by the military or our derivatives of military research. And I don't know, maybe Nick can speak to this too in terms of appropriating some of these GPS technologies and stuff like that. So there's a kind of really curious issue where we are right now historically, that we have to we sort of are trying to understand nature, but at the same time that the way that we understand it in many ways kind of feeds back into certain loops of sustaining that power that we're also indirectly criticizing, like in this room, like who controls those resources, or how much we're spending or consuming of a certain type of resource, right? And, so I think that that's worthwhile to think about. It gets back to the issue of money as well, and just how much money is invested in kind of military power in the U.S. And I think if you really kind of think about how much an aircraft carrier consumes, or how much a fighter jet consumes and all of that, you start to think about the U.S. military, and then this whole conversation about like global warming and all the topics we've been talking about really shifts, if a lot of that consumption actually didn't happen, right? So I don't know.
Okay. I'm going to have to wrap us up, because apparently there's cold beer getting warm, and warm and cold outside. So round of applause for